It is August 1914. A glorious summer in a Britain where everyone still wears hats. Where horses are more common on the streets than cars. Where cinema is silent and even a family photograph a special occasion. This is the Ellis family. William Ellis, a wealthy ship owner in Cardiff. His wife, Constance. Their children, Charlotte and Alfred. By the time their family portrait is printed, a devastating war will have broken out in Europe, changing their lives and Britain forever. Before the First World War, many people believed that Britain was really the wealthiest, most successful country in the world. Britain controlled the seas. The navies of other world powers were dwarfed by the British. It had a huge empire. A quarter of the world's population lived under British rule, and it dominated world trade. One of Britain's most valuable commodities was coal. Coal kept the world turning. It kept houses warm, powered factories, trains and ships. The coal mines of South Wales sent millions of tons of coal to Cardiff docks, which exported more coal around the world than any other port in Europe. As this 1909 cartoon says,
"'Tis little Wales that keeps me spinning."
And it was ship owners like William Ellis and his son Alfred who reaped the rewards. They were rich men in a rich country, but the distribution of the wealth was highly unequal. The annual Cardiff Shipowners photograph reeks of wealth and importance. The photograph of striking miners in 1912, however, reveals the hardship of life, rummaging for scraps of coal to keep their families warm in winter. Britain was divided by a class system. At the top of the pile were the wealthy upper class. Then came the middle class, people like doctors, lawyers and shopkeepers. At the bottom of the pile was the working class, miners, servants, manual workers. 80% of the population, they owned virtually nothing. This was a man's world where your wealth, education, job, accent and even your name tied you into one life or another. The writer George Orwell was brought up in a middle-class family.
The lower classes smell. That was what we were taught. And even lower-class people whom you knew to be quite clean, servants for instance, were faintly unappetizing. The smell of their sweat, the very texture of their skins, were mysteriously different from ours.
People like the Ellises employed lower-class people to cook, clean and look after them. Mrs. Ellis does not work. She is a lady of leisure. Upstairs is one world, downstairs another. 2 million servants toiled in British houses at this time. The work was hard and the pay was low. 23-year-old Ewan Jones has been taught a skill. Unlike Mr. Ellis, he can drive the new family automobile, for which he is paid £19 a year. His coal mining family think that he has landed a good job. Certainly, compared to working in the pits, domestic service is safe, clean, and as long as he knows his place, secure. Mary Davis, the housemaid, has to get up at 5 a.m. every day to light the fires. She does most of the more menial tasks. Scrubbing, washing, polishing, and must be polite at all times. For this, she gets £12 a year, plus food, clothing, and a room of her own. At any hour of the day, one of the Ellises may ring for her. Upstairs, Charlotte Ellis is getting dressed, an operation complex enough to require Mary's help. Charlotte is not expected to work or concern herself with finance or politics. Even privileged women at this time did not have the vote. Charlotte's life is governed by a set of rules known as etiquette. Whole books were written setting out the behavior appropriate to every situation. For example, how to hitch up your skirts in public without making this unseemly spectacle of yourself. Or making sure she's always chaperoned so that no liaisons develop with unsuitable young men. Scandal of that kind could tarnish her reputation in society. It would be a mistake, however, to imagine that everybody was happy with their way of life. Some women were campaigning for the vote. One group, known as suffragettes, had begun a determined and often violent campaign. The trades union movement was growing in power in crucial industries like coal and shipping. But then, on the 4th of August, 1914, war was declared, imposing a new set of priorities on everyone.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war. Wouldn't be a soldier, eh? Oh, it's a shame to take the day.
All over the country there was wild enthusiasm for the great adventure.
Oh, oh, up to the end of money we are. Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.
Recruiting stations were swamped with volunteers. None of these Cardiff volunteers would have had any idea about the realities of war. War was thought to be a glorious affair that the British usually won.
Oh, 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 it's a lovely war.
Caught up in the general enthusiasm, Alfred Ellis wraps up his affairs in the family business and joins the 38th Welsh Division. Though he has no military experience, his public school education means that he automatically becomes an officer. In contrast, Ewan, the family chauffeur, joins up as a private soldier. Everyone imagined a quick, heroic war, then home for Christmas. This conflict, far from being short and heroic, turns out to be long and brutal. Slaughter on this scale had never been dreamed of. War backed by industrial power. Machine guns, tanks, submarines and aeroplanes were the new weapons of war, churned out on the factory floors across Europe. The fighting created a huge demand for supplies, and at the same time a shortage of workers back home. This had two far-reaching effects. Firstly, it put the trade unions in a much stronger position than before. When strikes broke out in essential industries during the war, and they did frequently, government and employers often had to give in. Secondly, the shortage of men in the factories meant that there was no choice but to employ women. In this propaganda film, the figure of Britannia urges women to work for victory. For many women, it was their first chance to escape their restricted lives, and they leapt at it. They joined the Land Army, went to the front as nurses, and took on jobs which before had only been done by men. It gave them a new self-esteem, and the money in their pocket meant independence from the fathers and husbands who had once ruled their lives. Charlotte joins the voluntary aid detachment and finds herself tending soldiers on the front line. The carnage of war is appalling. In the face of what she sees here, much of what she used to think important, like etiquette, seems meaningless. The war had a huge appetite, gobbling up lives and supplies. Mary leaves her housemaid's job and becomes a munitions worker. Here, she earns far more than the Ellises had ever paid her. Conditions for factory workers improved greatly during the war. High output depended on good health, and so medical checks were provided, canteens built, and even creches set up to look after workers' children. For the Ellis Shipping Company, the war is great business. Merchant ships are crucial to supply the war effort in France, and any that are sunk are replaced by the government. On the 6th of November, 1918, a telegram arrives at the Ellis household, closely followed by a small box containing one postcard, one pipe, one Bible, one wristwatch. All that was left of their son, Alfred. The adventure that was to be over by Christmas had dragged on for 4 years, claiming 9 million lives, 800,000 of them British. A large swathe of the country's young men had simply disappeared. Before the war, this amateur football team in Cardiff was made up of 20-year-olds. After, the few survivors had to be augmented by old men. Of those who survived, 250,000 came back permanently maimed in some way. And for many, a return to normal life was impossible. Ewan, the family chauffeur, survives the war but returns without his right leg. He is hospitalised at the Prince of Wales Hospital in Cardiff. He has fought through a new type of war that no one, not even the generals, had known how to fight. His war experience has left him with a bitter distrust of the upper classes. Ewan could now never go back to domestic service. The returning soldiers were promised a land fit for heroes to live in. But this post-war optimism soon disappeared as Britain was hit by an economic slump. Whereas during the war everyone had a job, by 1921, 1.4 million were jobless. Mary, the housemaid, finds her liberation short-lived. The returning soldiers take what jobs are available. A woman's place is once more in the home. She has no option but to return to service in the Ellis household. For educated women, however, there were now more opportunities for jobs and independence. As a result of women's part in the war effort, many men who had previously been against the vote for women changed their minds. J.L. Garvin, editor of the Observer newspaper, wrote in 1917,
Time was when I thought men alone maintained the state. Now I know that the modern state must be dependent on women and men alike.
In 1918, women over 30 who owned property were allowed to vote. A year later, Nancy Astor entered Parliament as Britain's first woman MP. It was a start. The things Charlotte has seen in the war make a return to her pre-war life impossible. She gets herself a job and becomes more independent. Now she smokes in public, wears her hair and dresses short, and uses makeup. At weekends, she goes to parties. Without a chaperone. Things were never the same again for Mr. Ellis. There is a brief post-war boom in Cardiff docks, but soon British coal exports are undermined by cheaper foreign coal. Britain was no longer the rich country it had been. The war had been paid for with borrowed money, and Britain's debt stood at £7,809 million. As a result of the war, taxes had risen sharply, and people like Mr. Ellis find it impossible to maintain the lavish lifestyles of pre-war days. Mr. Ellis blames it all on the rise of the working classes. The trade union movement had emerged from the war with 6.5 million members and showed its muscle in a series of strikes in the early 20s. Its leadership was now a force that governments had to reckon with. The face of British politics had changed. The Labour Party was gaining ground, and in 1924 were voted into government for the first time. In South Wales, there were reports of political agitators stirring up the miners of the valleys into action and even revolution. To Mr. Ellis, the world seems to be dissolving into a socialist madness. The old world that Mr. and Mrs. Ellis knew had gone without trace. However, for the young, the Great War had upset the apple cart. For many, this was a time of great opportunity to pick up the pieces and start again. Although the Ellises are a fictional family, they are real in the sense that everything about them has been based on actual historical examples. These events really happened, and all these people, the rich, the poor, the maids, the workers, the nurses and the soldiers, really existed. By looking at the shadows they left behind, we can see how Britain was changed by the Great War, and how it began to evolve into the country we live in today. This episode of History File was produced in Cardiff by BBC Wales. It was devised and created by this especially assembled team of actors, musicians, designers, technicians and programme makers, and narrated by me, Juliet Stevenson. The executive producer was Mr. Di Williams.
Watcher!